There is a whole category at the Academy Awards that exists largely because of this one movie. Before 1981, Hollywood had never given a competitive Oscar for makeup until audiences watched a young man's body crack and tear itself into a monster in full bright light, and the Academy realized it had no way to honor what it had just seen. This is An American Werewolf in London, John Landis's 1981 horror comedy, starring David Naughton with groundbreaking effects by Rick Baker. Today, we count down 20 weird facts and stick around for number one, the direct reason the most famous music video ever made exists. Subscribe and drop a comment. Beware the moon. Let's get into it. For decades, the Academy of Motion Picture Arts and Sciences had no award for makeup. The craft that turned actors into monsters, aliens, and old men had never been deemed worthy of its own competitive Oscar, a snub that had grown increasingly indefensible as makeup artistry advanced. The final straw for many was the lack of recognition for the astonishing work in The Elephant Man in 1980. And then came An American Werewolf in London, whose transformation effects were so revolutionary that the Academy could no longer look away. In 1981, the Academy established the award for Best Makeup, and Rick Baker won the very first one for his work on this film. He was around 31 years old at the time, making him not just the inaugural winner, but also the youngest person ever to take the award, a record that would stand for years. The category exists today, honoring every prosthetic and creature and aging effect the movies produce, in no small part because one horror comedy in 1981 did something on screen that the film industry simply had no vocabulary to reward. Baker did not just win an Oscar. His work helped call the Oscar itself into being. The origin of An American Werewolf in London lies on a dirt road in what was then Yugoslavia in 1969. John Landis, only 19 years old, was working as a lowly production assistant on the Clint Eastwood war film Kelly's Heroes. While traveling through the remote countryside with a local crew member, Landis and his companion were forced to stop when they came upon a Roma funeral taking place at the roadside. What Landis witnessed haunted and fascinated him. The body was being buried in an unusually deep grave, positioned feet first and wrapped in garlic, a ritual specifically intended to prevent the dead man from rising from his grave. The sight lodged itself in the young Landis's imagination. He became captivated by the idea of an ordinary, rational, modern person suddenly colliding with genuine, supernatural horror, with the ancient belief in the returning dead. That single roadside encounter with a real burial rite, performed by people who truly feared the undead, planted the seed for the entire film. Landis, a teenager who loved monster movies, went home and poured the experience into a screenplay about a young American backpacker thrust into exactly that nightmare. The most acclaimed werewolf film of its era was born from a real funeral glimpsed from a passing car. John Landis wrote his screenplay around 1969, but the film would not reach theaters until 1981. For more than 10 years, it sat on the shelf, repeatedly rejected, because the very quality that would later make it a classic was the thing nobody could accept. The script blended genuine horror with genuine comedy, and prospective financiers found this combination baffling and unmarketable. They believed it was too frightening to work as a comedy and too funny to work as a horror film, an unsellable creature that fell between two genres. The rejections could be blunt. Landis had hoped to interest the famed James Bond producer Albert Broccoli in the project, and when Broccoli read the script, his response was reportedly a flat refusal, telling Landis simply that it was too weird. The film only became possible after Landis spent the 1970s proving himself as a commercial director, delivering a string of comedy hits including National Lampoon's Animal House and The Blues Brothers. That success finally bought him the clout and the trust to make his strange passion project on his own terms. The movie that no one would touch for over a decade was waiting, all along, for its writer to become powerful enough to force it into existence. The centerpiece of An American Werewolf in London, the sequence that changed movie effects forever, is David's agonizing transformation into the beast, and the single boldest decision behind it was written right into the script by John Landis. The change would happen not in the shadows, not in flickering darkness or concealing gloom, as every werewolf transformation before it had, but in bright, full, unforgiving light, holding on the horror without a single merciful place to hide. This was a direct challenge to Rick Baker and his team, because bright light is the enemy of special effects. Darkness forgives seams and imperfections and mechanical joints. Full illumination exposes everything. By insisting the transformation play out fully lit, Landis was betting the entire film on Baker's work being good enough to survive that scrutiny, and Baker rose to it completely. The sequence, which took around 6 days to film and required full body casts of David Naughton, shows skin stretching, bones cracking and reshaping, hands and feet elongating, all in merciless clarity. There is a small irony to the triumph. Baker was reportedly disappointed by how briefly the painstaking face-changing effect he had labored over for months actually appears on screen. Landis, meanwhile, later felt he had lingered on the scene too long, so mesmerized by the work that he let it run. Rick Baker's involvement with An American Werewolf in London stretched back years because John Landis had been discussing the film with him since the early days of both their careers, giving Baker an unusually long runway to dream up effects no one had seen before. But the film's endless delays created a problem. While Landis struggled to get financing, another werewolf movie went into production, Joe Dante's The Howling, and Baker had signed on to create its effects, having already begun developing some of the very ideas he had generated for Landis. When An American Werewolf in London finally came together, Baker faced a choice, and he chose loyalty to the project he had been attached to for so long. He left The Howling to make Landis's film, handing his werewolf duties on the rival production over to his talented young protege, Rob Bottin, who would go on to create the legendary effects in The Thing. The result was that 1981 became a landmark year with two groundbreaking werewolf transformation films arriving nearly at once, born from the same effects lineage, made by a mentor and his student who had split to work on competing monsters. It was the beginning of a genuine werewolf zeitgeist, a sudden wave of lycanthrope films, and Baker had helped seed both of its first great entries. When John Landis hired Rick Baker, he gave him one of the most evocative creative briefs in horror history. He did not want the traditional werewolf, the upright, bipedal, man-shaped wolf with a snout that had defined the creature since Lon Chaney Jr. shuffled through the fog 4 decades earlier. Landis wanted something that moved like a true predator. His direction to Baker was to create a 4-legged hound from hell, a beast that ran on all fours like a real hunting animal, rather than lurching about on 2 legs like a man in a costume. Baker, given what he described as rare and total artistic freedom, delivered exactly that. A nightmarish quadruped that resembles something between an enormous wolf and a bear, low and fast and genuinely animalistic. This was a deliberate break from the entire screen tradition of the werewolf, a rejection of the sympathetic, upright wolfman in favor of raw, 4-footed monstrosity. Tellingly, the film shows the finished creature only in brief, fragmentary glimpses, never lingering in a clear, sustained look. Baker and Landis understood that the beast was most terrifying when the audience could not fully study it, catching only flashes of teeth and fur and impossible motion. The most influential film werewolf of its generation runs on 4 legs and is barely ever fully seen. David Naughton, who plays the doomed David Kessler, was not a horror star or even a widely known dramatic actor when he was cast. He was, at the time, best recognized as the energetic, singing, dancing pitchman from a popular series of Dr. Pepper soft drink commercials, the cheerful face of the Be a Pepper advertising campaign. In fact, John Landis reportedly cast him in part after seeing him in one of those very commercials, spotting a likable everyman quality that suited the role. The casting came at a real cost to Naughton, and it is a genuinely strange footnote to the production. An American Werewolf in London required Naughton to appear nude on screen, most memorably in the scene where he wakes up naked in the zoo after a night as the wolf. Dr. Pepper, the wholesome soft drink brand that had built an ad campaign around his clean-cut charm, was not pleased to have their smiling spokesman appearing naked in an R-rated horror film full of gore and sex. The company let him go over it. Naughton traded his steady, wholesome commercial gig for the lead in a werewolf movie, and the werewolf movie cost him the soda deal. He became a horror icon and an unemployed pitchman in the same stroke. One of the most original and unsettling ideas in An American Werewolf in London is what happens to the people the werewolf kills. In this film's mythology, the victims of a werewolf do not simply die and move on. They are trapped in a horrifying limbo, existing as the restless undead, unable to find peace and pass into true death for as long as the bloodline of the werewolf that killed them survives. They are stuck, conscious and decaying, in a purgatory with no exit. This is why David's dead friend Jack keeps returning to him throughout the film, appearing in progressively more rotted and mutilated form. Jack is not a ghost or a hallucination in the ordinary sense. He is a soul held in agonizing limbo, and he has come to explain the terrible logic to David and to beg him for the only release available. The only way Jack and the other victims can finally rest is if David, the last living link in the werewolf's line, dies. So the undead gather around David, most memorably in a crowded scene where they calmly, almost politely, urge him to kill himself, offering helpful suggestions for how he might do it, all so that they can finally be free. It is horror and black comedy fused into something genuinely haunting. The role of Jack, David's murdered best friend, played by Griffin Dunne, presented Rick Baker with a distinct and grisly challenge running parallel to the werewolf itself. Because Jack exists as a restless undead, appearing to David again and again across the film, and because his body continues to decompose the entire time, Baker had to design a character whose corpse rots progressively worse in every single appearance. Each time Jack returns, he is further gone, more decayed, more horrifying to look at than the time before. This meant Griffin Dunne endured escalating stages of elaborate, uncomfortable decomposition makeup as the shoot went on, playing an increasingly ghastly cadaver while delivering some of the film's driest, funniest lines. The contrast is a huge part of the film's peculiar magic, a putrefying corpse cracking wise. Baker's work on Jack is sometimes overshadowed by the famous transformation, but the steadily rotting friend is a masterpiece of makeup in its own right. There was even a moment cut from the film, sacrificed to secure an R rating, in which a piece of toast Jack was eating fell out of the open wound in his torn throat, a detail so grotesque that it had to go. The friend did not just die, he kept dying, in front of the audience for the whole movie. An American Werewolf in London is famous for its soundtrack of pop songs rather than a traditional orchestral score, but it does contain a small amount of original composed music. And the name behind it is a genuine surprise. The film's few passages of dedicated dramatic score were written by Elmer Bernstein, one of the most celebrated and prolific film composers in Hollywood history, the man behind the music for The Magnificent Seven, The Ten Commandments, and countless other classics. To have a composer of that stature contribute just a few minutes of music to a horror comedy is remarkable. Bernstein's contribution was concentrated on the film's most disturbing passages, most notably David's surreal and terrifying nightmare sequences. The most infamous of these is A Dream Within a Dream, in which David envisions his family being slaughtered in their home by monstrous, demonic, mutant creatures brandishing weapons, a sudden burst of a pure nightmare that has nothing to do with the werewolf plot and everything to do with dread. Landis drew inspiration for this nested dream structure from the surrealist cinema of Luis Buñuel. The sequence is a jolt of genuine horror in a film that is often funny, and Bernstein's rare, understated score helped give those nightmares their unnerving weight. If you're loving this trip back to one of the greatest horror comedies ever made, take a second to hit the like button and subscribe, and drop a comment telling me the single scariest or funniest moment in this whole film. Alright, back to the moors. The film's chaotic climax, in which the fully transformed werewolf rampages through central London, was staged in the real Piccadilly Circus, one of the busiest and most iconic intersections in the entire city. Getting permission to do this was a near impossible feat. Filming had been banned in Piccadilly Circus for around 15 years because of the enormous traffic disruption it caused, and no production had been allowed to take it over in all that time. John Landis had to win the cooperation of the London Metropolitan Police to pull it off. His method was pure showmanship. Landis arranged a free screening of his hit comedy, The Blues Brothers, and invited hundreds of London police officers to attend. They loved it, and the goodwill translated directly into permission to shoot in the forbidden location. Even then, the constraints were severe. The crew was allowed to film only in the small hours of the morning across 2 February nights, and could halt the traffic just a handful of times for a maximum of 2 minutes at a stretch. Landis meticulously recreated the area elsewhere so the crew could rehearse the mayhem in advance and execute it perfectly in those tiny windows. Landis himself appears in the sequence, in a director cameo, as a pedestrian who is struck by a car and hurled through a plate glass window. David Naughton spent a striking amount of An American Werewolf in London completely nude and not in the comfort of a closed, warm studio. The film's logic required it. When David transforms into the wolf, his clothes are destroyed, so when he wakes up human again after a night of slaughter, he is naked and disoriented, with no idea where he is or what he has done. This leads to the film's most beloved comic set piece, in which a bewildered, undressed David finds himself waking up inside the wolf enclosure at the London Zoo and has to sneak his way back into the city with no clothes on. The resulting sequence, with David desperately trying to cover himself and improvise his way home through a very public London, is a masterclass of physical comedy, capped by the immortal moment when he snatches a bunch of balloons from a child to hide his nakedness, prompting the child to loudly announce to his mother that a naked American man has stolen his balloons. Playing all of this required Naughton to actually be naked and exposed, often in the cold, performing elaborate comic business while wearing nothing at all. The vulnerability that makes the scene so funny and so human was entirely real. He truly was out there with nothing to hide behind but a fistful of stolen balloons. An American Werewolf in London is famous, and to some viewers infamous, for how abruptly it ends. After the werewolves rampage through Piccadilly Circus, David, in beast form, is cornered in an alley. The nurse Alex, who has fallen in love with him, calls out to him, trying to reach the human being inside the monster. For a moment, his eyes seem to soften. Then the police open fire and David is shot dead, his body collapsing back into its naked human form on the pavement. And that is essentially it. The film cuts almost immediately to the end credits, set jarringly to a cheerful version of the song Blue Moon. This shocking abruptness was entirely intentional. John Landis always meant for the film to end on a sudden, tragic, unsoftened note, denying the audience any lingering emotional cushion or tidy resolution. There is no epilogue, no drawn-out mourning, no comfort. The hero simply dies, and the movie is over, and an upbeat love song plays over the credits as if nothing terrible has happened. That deliberate collision of tragedy and breezy pop is the film's entire tonal philosophy compressed into its final seconds. Some viewers and critics found the ending jarringly unfinished. Landis knew exactly what he was doing. He wanted the loss to land like a slap, not a lullaby. Early in the film, before any horror has occurred, David and Jack take shelter from the cold in a remote pub on the moors called the Slaughtered Lamb, where they receive a decidedly frosty welcome from the suspicious locals. As the two Americans blunder their way toward leaving and heading back out into the night, the villagers, who know exactly what stalks the darkness, offer them a warning that has since become one of the most quoted lines in the entire werewolf genre. They are told to stay on the road, keep clear of the moors, and beware the moon. David and Jack, being rational young men from a world without monsters, promptly ignore every word of it, wandering off the road and onto the moors under a bright moon and sealing their doom. The warning is beautifully economical, a piece of dialogue that functions as both genuine folk dread and, in hindsight, grim comedy, because the audience knows the pair are walking straight into the jaws of the thing the villagers fear. The line has endured for decades, endlessly quoted and referenced, a perfect distillation of the ancient rural terror that the film's modern American heroes are too worldly to take seriously until it is far too late. In the film's tense climax, David follows his undead friend Jack into a seedy Piccadilly cinema, and the pornographic film playing on the screen inside is titled "See You Next Wednesday." This is not a random gag. The phrase "See you next Wednesday" is John Landis' personal signature, a recurring in joke that he has deliberately hidden inside nearly every film he has directed across his entire career. A little private tradition for those in the know to spot. The origin of the phrase is a lovely piece of film history. Landis borrowed it from Stanley Kubrick's 2001, A Space Odyssey, in which a version of the line appears in a recorded video message. Landis liked it so much that he adopted it as his career-long calling card. What makes its appearance in An American Werewolf in London especially notable is that the production actually shot a complete fake pornographic film to serve as the movie within the movie, and that faux skin flick, See You Next Wednesday, was reportedly the very first thing filmed for the entire production. So the movie about a werewolf opened its shoot by making a fake porno named after a Kubrick line. Fans have hunted for the phrase across Landis' filmography ever since. The reason the famous transformation looks so viscerally real, even decades later, is that almost none of it was an illusion of editing. It was built physically out of mechanical devices and puppetry engineered by Rick Baker's team. Alongside the prosthetic appliances glued directly onto David Naughton, Baker constructed elaborate mechanical puppet reproductions of parts of Naughton's body, including his head, hands, feet, and torso, which he nicknamed his Change-O heads. These were operated from below and behind, often with the actor's real body concealed within a false floor or table. When David's hand stretches and elongates, that is a mechanical puppet hand inflating and extending on cue. When his back arches and swells and his face pushes outward into a snout, those are engineered devices driven by hidden operators, filmed in that merciless bright light. The transformation is a symphony of practical trickery, air bladders, cable controls, and hand-built animatronic body parts, all choreographed to appear as one continuous, agonizing metamorphosis. There is not a frame of computer imagery anywhere in it, because in 1981, no such thing existed for this purpose. Everything you recoil from was a real object moving in real space in front of the lens, which is precisely why it has never stopped feeling real. An American Werewolf in London is deeply aware of the werewolf films that came before it, and it treats that legacy with a knowing, affectionate irreverence. The film is an explicit homage to the 1941 Universal classic The Wolfman, so much so that David himself is written as a fan of the old werewolf mythology, name checking the lore for the people around him. But rather than solemnly obeying the old rules, the film cheerfully pokes fun at them, treating the ancient conventions as something its modern characters find slightly absurd even as they get killed by them. The clearest example comes when David's undead victims are urging him to kill himself to end the curse. David, drawing on his knowledge of werewolf movies, asks whether he does not need a silver bullet to do the job properly, invoking the single most famous rule in all of werewolf lore. Jack witheringly tells him to be serious. The film waves away the sacred silver bullet as childish nonsense, and indeed David is ultimately brought down by perfectly ordinary police gunfire. This playful demolition of inherited werewolf rules, while still delivering genuine terror, is central to the film's identity. It loves the old monster movies enough to laugh at them, and it is confident enough in its own horror to throw away the rulebook. John Landis built a quiet, clever running joke into the very soundtrack of the film, one that many viewers enjoy for years before they consciously notice it. Every single pop song featured in An American Werewolf in London has the word moon in its title. The film opens and closes with versions of Blue Moon, and along the way it deploys Creedence Clearwater Revival's Bad Moon Rising and Van Morrison's Moon Dance. Landis used no fewer than 3 separate recordings of Blue Moon alone by different artists, threading the lunar theme through the whole picture as a sly wink at the werewolf's connection to the moon. The joke was so committed that Landis reportedly tried to license still more moon-themed songs, including Cat Stevens' Moon Shadow and a Bob Dylan track, only to be turned down. According to Landis, Cat Stevens refused in part because he actually believed werewolves were real and did not want his music associated with them, while Dylan declined for religious reasons. Amusingly, there is apparently no record of Landis even attempting to license the most on-the-nose option imaginable, Warren Zevon's Werewolves of London, perhaps because it would have been too obvious. The entire soundtrack is a hidden pun, hummed by the audience without their quite realizing the punchline. The man who reinvented the movie Werewolf and won the first ever makeup Oscar for it was, at the time, astonishingly young. Rick Baker was only around 30 or 31 years old when An American Werewolf in London was released, making his mastery of the craft all the more remarkable. He was not a grizzled veteran at the end of a long career capping it with a masterpiece. He was a young man near the beginning, already operating at the absolute peak of his field. Baker was, by his own cheerful description, a lifelong monster kid, someone who had loved creatures and monster movies since childhood and had begun building artificial body parts in his own kitchen as a teenager. That youthful obsession translated into a prodigy's career. Before this film, he had already contributed to major productions, working on the 1976 remake of King Kong and creating memorable creatures for the Cantina sequence in Star Wars. An American Werewolf in London was the film that crowned him, and it launched a record-breaking run. Baker would go on to win the Academy Award for Best Makeup 7 times across his career, more than anyone else in history, a dynasty that began with a young man turning David Naughton into a hound from hell. Here is the fact that connects this horror comedy to the single most famous piece of pop culture of its decade. In 1983, Michael Jackson released the music video for Thriller, a 14-minute short film in which Jackson transforms into a werewolf and then leads an army of dancing zombies through the night. It became, and largely remains, the most celebrated and influential music video ever made, and it exists in the form it does because of An American Werewolf in London. Michael Jackson was a devoted fan of this film. He was so impressed by it, and specifically by its groundbreaking monster effects and its playful blend of horror and entertainment, that when he set out to make Thriller, he went straight to the source. He personally hired John Landis to direct the video, and Rick Baker to create its makeup and transformation effects precisely because of the work the two had done together on this werewolf movie. Baker even appears in a brief cameo in the finished video. So the transformation that made you gasp in 1981 led directly to the werewolf and the zombies that made the entire world dance in 1983. Without this strange, rejected, decade-delayed horror comedy about two backpackers on the moors, the most famous music video in history would not exist as we know it. The Wolf begat the king of pop's masterpiece. So there you have it. 20 weird facts about a movie that invented an Oscar, sprang from a real roadside burial, sat rejected for a decade, and turned a soda commercial star into a naked, balloon-stealing werewolf. It hit a moon in every song, shot a fake porno first, took over Piccadilly Circus, and reinvented the werewolf so convincingly that Michael Jackson built Thriller on its back. It looks like a monster movie. It is really a landmark that reshaped horror, comedy, and pop music at once. Like, subscribe, and share this with the friend you would want beside you on the moors, the one who would ignore the warning. Until next time, stay on the road and beware the moon.